The late autumn wind howled across the Wyoming plains as the search party rode through territory that seemed increasingly hostile with each passing mile. Captain James "Jim" Harrison led 5 experienced cowboys, all veterans of numerous cattle drives and frontier expeditions. They had been hired by the Army to locate a missing wagon train that had departed from Fort Laramie 6 weeks earlier, bound for Oregon Territory. The train, consisting of 15 families, had simply vanished somewhere along the trail. Jim was a man of 32 years, hardened by life on the frontier but still possessed of a strong sense of duty. He had seen too many tragedies on the plains to be optimistic, but he was thorough and determined. His companions were cut from similar cloth. Men who knew the land, could track through any terrain, and wouldn't quit until they found answers. On the 4th day of their search, they discovered the first signs of the wagon train. Wheel ruts, deeper than they should have been, suggested the wagons had been struggling through difficult terrain. Then they found the first abandoned wagon, its contents scattered, clear signs of panic in how belongings had been hastily thrown aside. The scene told a grim story of people running from something, leaving behind everything they owned in their desperation to escape. As they followed the trail, the evidence grew more disturbing. More abandoned wagons, some burned, others simply left where they stood. But no bodies, no clear indication of what had happened to the families. It was as if they had simply dissolved into the prairie air. "This doesn't make sense," said Tom McAllister, Jim's second-in-command. "Even if they were attacked, there would be signs. Bodies, graves, something. Where did they all go?" Jim studied the scene with growing unease. The wagon train had been traveling along a route that should have been relatively safe. There were no recent reports of Indian attacks in the area, and the weather, while growing colder, hadn't been severe enough to cause this level of disaster. It was on the morning of the 5th day that they heard it, a sound so faint that Jim initially thought he had imagined it. A voice, weak but unmistakably human, calling for help. The men spurred their horses toward the sound, and what they found nearly stopped Jim's heart. A woman stood on a rocky outcropping about 200 yards ahead, waving frantically. She was alone, her dress torn and dirty, her blonde hair tangled and hanging loose around her shoulders. As they rode closer, Jim could see she was young, perhaps 25, and despite her obvious distress, she stood with a bearing that suggested strength and determination. "Please," she called as they approached, her voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. "Please, you have to help them. There's not much time." Jim dismounted quickly, offering her his water canteen. She drank gratefully but refused to sit, refused to rest. "The others," she insisted. "The families from the wagon train. They're trapped in a canyon about 3 miles west of here. There was a landslide, blocked the only way out. We've been there for 2 weeks, and our supplies are almost gone." Her name was Catherine Wells, she explained between gulps of water. She was a schoolteacher from Philadelphia who had been traveling with her aunt and uncle on the wagon train. When the landslide had trapped them in the canyon, the group had taken stock of their situation and realized they needed help. The canyon walls were too steep to climb with children and elderly people, and their attempts to clear the rocks blocking the entrance had proven futile. "I volunteered to climb out," Catherine continued, her blue eyes fierce with determination despite her exhaustion. "It took me 2 days to find a route up the canyon wall. I've been walking for 3 days, trying to find help, afraid I was going in the wrong direction, afraid I'd die before I found anyone." Jim studied her with new respect. The climb she described would have been difficult for an experienced frontiersman. For a city woman in long skirts, it must have been nearly impossible. "You should have stayed with the group," he said, though without criticism. "What you did was incredibly dangerous." "Staying meant watching children slowly starve," Catherine replied sharply. "That wasn't acceptable. I had to try." Jim nodded, already organizing his men. "Tom, you and Williams ride back to Fort Laramie. Tell them we found the wagon train and we need supplies, ropes, maybe some explosives to clear the rocks. The rest of us will head to that canyon with Miss Wells and see what we can do to help in the meantime." As they rode toward the canyon, Catherine told them the full story. The wagon train had been following what their guide assured them was a shortcut. They had entered the canyon believing it would save them 2 days of travel. Instead, late on their second night in the canyon, A combination of heavy rain and unstable rock had caused a massive landslide that sealed the entrance behind them. Their guide had been killed in the initial landslide, along with 2 other men who had been standing watch near the entrance. The remaining families had quickly realized they were trapped. The canyon provided some shelter and had a small stream for water, but game was scarce, and their supplies were dwindling rapidly. "We've been rationing carefully," Catherine explained, "but there are children, and some of the elderly are already weak. We thought about trying to get everyone up the way I climbed out, but it's too dangerous. 3 people tried after I left, and 1 fell. She broke her leg and nearly died. After that, they decided to wait, to hope I'd find help." Jim could hear the weight of responsibility in her voice. She had taken on the burden of dozens of lives, had risked everything on a desperate gamble, and now she was guiding strangers back to save her people. It was a level of courage that commanded respect. When they reached the canyon, Jim understood immediately why the situation was so dire. The entrance was completely blocked by an enormous pile of rocks and debris. Even with all his men working, it would take days to clear by hand. The canyon walls were sheer in most places, impossible to climb, especially for families with children and possessions. Catherine led them to the spot where she had climbed out, a treacherous route that made Jim's stomach clench just looking at it. He couldn't imagine making that climb in a dress, exhausted and hungry. But there was no time for admiration. They needed to get supplies down to the trapped families immediately. Using ropes, they lowered food, water, and medical supplies. Jim climbed down himself to assess the situation and coordinate with the trapped families. What he found was both heartbreaking and inspiring. The families had organized themselves, rationed their supplies with rigid discipline, cared for the sick and elderly, and maintained order despite their desperate circumstances. And at the center of it all, he learned, had been Catherine Wells. She kept everyone's spirits up, an older woman told Jim. When people started to panic, she organized the children into classes, kept them busy learning. When supplies got low, she made it a game to see who could make their rations last longest. And when it became clear we needed outside help, she volunteered to make that climb without hesitation. Over the next 3 days, as they waited for help to arrive from Fort Laramie, Jim worked tirelessly to improve conditions in the canyon. He and his men hunted for game, brought down more supplies, and began the slow process of clearing rocks. But more than that, Jim found himself drawn to Catherine Wells in a way he had never experienced before. She wasn't just beautiful, though she certainly was that, even dirty and exhausted. She was competent, courageous, and possessed of a quiet strength that inspired everyone around her. She never complained about her own hardships, never sought special treatment, and worked alongside everyone else despite having just completed an ordeal that would have broken most people. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day of work, Jim finally voiced what had been growing in his mind. "What you did, Miss Wells, climbing out of this canyon, walking for 3 days with no guarantee you'd find help. That took more courage than most men I know possess." Catherine smiled tiredly. "It wasn't courage, Captain Harrison. It was necessity. Those families needed help, and I was the only one capable of getting it. Sometimes we do what we must, not what we want. But you chose to volunteer. Others could have tried. Perhaps. But I was a schoolteacher with no children or elderly parents to worry about. I was the logical choice." She paused, staring into the fire. "Though I'll admit, there were moments during that climb when I questioned my logic rather severely." Jim laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise both of them. "I imagine so. I've been climbing and exploring these territories for 15 years, and I wouldn't have attempted that route without serious consideration." "Then it's fortunate I didn't know enough to be properly afraid," Catherine replied with a slight smile. When help finally arrived from Fort Laramie, it came in the form of an engineer, supplies, and equipment. With careful use of small explosive charges, they were able to widen a crack in the rock pile, creating an opening large enough for people to pass through. It took 2 more days of careful work, but finally, the families were able to leave the canyon that had been their prison for weeks. The reunion with the outside world was emotional. Families wept with relief. Children ran and played in the open space after weeks of confinement, and everyone expressed gratitude to the search party and especially to Catherine, whose desperate gamble had saved them all. As the families were organized for the journey back to Fort Laramie, where they would rest and resupply before deciding whether to continue their journey or return east, Jim found himself facing an unexpected dilemma. His contract was complete. The wagon train had been found, the families rescued. He should return to Fort Laramie, collect his payment, and move on to the next job. But the thought of watching Catherine Wells walk out of his life was suddenly unbearable. He found her helping pack supplies, always working, always useful. "Miss Wells, might I have a word?" Catherine set down the bundle she was carrying and turned to him with a questioning look. "Of course, Captain." Jim removed his hat, suddenly feeling awkward in a way he hadn't experienced since he was a teenager. "I know this is going to sound strange, and perhaps inappropriate given the circumstances, but I need to say it before you leave and I lose my nerve." Catherine's expression shifted from curiosity to something more guarded. "Go on. These past few days, working alongside you, seeing your courage and your character, I've come to realize something." Jim took a breath. "I've spent 15 years wandering this frontier, never staying in one place, never forming attachments. I told myself I preferred it that way, that I was meant to be alone. But I was wrong. I just hadn't met the right person to make me want to stay." Catherine's eyes widened, but she remained silent, letting him continue. "I know we barely know each other. I know you have plans, a life you were trying to reach in Oregon. But I'm asking you to consider something different. Consider staying here, in this territory. Consider giving me a chance to court you properly, to show you that I could be worth changing your plans for." "Captain Harrison." "Jim," he interrupted. "Please, call me Jim." Catherine smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "Jim, then. What you're asking. It's not something I can answer immediately. A week ago, I was a schoolteacher heading to Oregon. Then I was fighting for survival. Now you're asking me to completely reimagine my future. I know. And I'm not asking for an answer right now. But I am asking for a chance. Stay at Fort Laramie for a few weeks while these families recover and make their plans. Let me court you properly. If, at the end of that time, you decide to continue to Oregon, I'll accept that. But at least give us both a chance to see if this feeling is real or just born of unusual circumstances." Catherine studied him for a long moment, and Jim could see her sharp intelligence assessing, calculating, considering all the angles. Finally, she spoke. "You should know, Jim, that I'm not the kind of woman who does things halfway. If I agree to this, if I decide to explore these feelings, I'm doing so with the intention of finding a true partnership, not just a frontier romance. I want a partner who respects my mind as well as my heart, who will support me in building something meaningful, whether that's a school or a community or a family. Can you be that man?" Jim didn't hesitate. "I can try. And I promise you, if I fail, it won't be for lack of effort or commitment." Catherine held out her hand, and Jim took it, feeling the calluses earned during her desperate climb, proof of her extraordinary strength. "Then yes, Captain Harrison, Jim, I'll stay at Fort Laramie. I'll give us both a chance to see if the extraordinary circumstances that brought us together might lead to something even more extraordinary." 6 months later, Jim and Catherine were married in a ceremony at Fort Laramie, attended by all the families from the wagon train and most of the fort's population. Catherine had started a school that served both the fort's children and those of nearby settlements. Jim had taken a position as a guide and scout, work that kept him closer to home than his previous wandering lifestyle. Years later, when their children asked how they met, Jim would smile and say, "We went searching for a lost wagon train and found something we didn't even know we were looking for." And Catherine, always practical, would add, "Sometimes the greatest adventures come from the detours, not the planned route." The families they had rescued never forgot that it was Catherine's courage that had saved them. Her desperate climb and determined search for help had not only rescued dozens of people from a slow death, but it also brought two people together in a partnership that would last a lifetime. Out of disaster had come something beautiful, proof that even in the harshest circumstances, hope and love could flourish.